Next speaker today, I'd like to invite up to the podium Clifford Young, President of Polling and Societal Trends at Ipsos.
Oh, that guy. I'm actually wearing the exact same. Boy, that's embarrassing, right? I should have known that that was a picture. So I'm not 100% sure how the technology up here works. Do I have control of this?
It doesn't work.
Okay, I'm not, I might have to step aside. So my name's Cliff Young, and I'm president at Ipsos. Ipsos is a market and social research company. It's the third largest in the world. We have coverage of 90 countries or boots on the ground in 90 countries, and we cover about 130. We work with a whole bunch of clients in the United States, private sector, public sector, including the federal government, as well as the third sector. And I am a professional pollster, but I will not say what's going to happen because I know, but I won't say. No, truly, it's one of those things. And if you want to talk about it in more detail, we can do it over drinks after the session. But I will make some references to the elections. And so what I wanted to do, and this is a session about innovation, about facilitated innovation on the public sector side. And I wanted to step back a bit and take a 30,000-foot view and look at it from a slightly different perspective. And not just sort of in a macro way, in an abstract way, conceptual way that's not very useful. I want to give you some takeaways to sort of help you think about how to facilitate more efficient innovation. And indeed, as I see it and based upon the basic science, innovation requires collaboration, interaction, and intense interaction, trustful interaction among humans. And the question is, how do you facilitate that in a world that is less than trustful, right? And so what I'll do is I'm going to step back a bit because I have to, because I'm a pollster. We're going to look at some big macro trends. Then I want to go sort of, if I don't go into sort of the subatomic sort of realm, I want to talk a little bit about the cognitive science, the brain science, so we can glean something about how we process information as humans to help us build trust looking forward. And so the last section will be like 3 takeaways to help you go back and make sure your innovation programs are optimally trust-ridden in a good way. So the next slide, let's see. It's this side. Is that you?
I got it.
You got it. You got it. There we go. Next slide. That's actually the first slide. The next slide. And so social trends. I think I'm going to step out. I think it's going to be easier for me as I wanted to innovate, but I couldn't innovate. I wanted to be different than the last speaker, but the last speaker innovated the right way. But just 2 big, broad social trends I want to talk about, which, by the way, we hear in the campaigns today. I don't want to say too much about that. This is not the place. The first one, next slide, is basically a widespread belief that the system is broken. It doesn't matter how you measure it. You can measure it. Yeah. Do you trust other people? We don't have that here. Do you believe the system is broken? Is how we often look at it on my side of the fence. Is the establishment something you can trust, right? Do you believe in parties and politicians anymore? Is the system rigged? By the way, we hear this over and over again. Don't we hear this year here in the United States? We also know at Ipsos, this is a global phenomenon. So there's this moment we live in of widespread systemic distrust. I don't trust other people. You don't trust me. We know, obviously, the negative outcomes from that, difficulties of coming to consensus, difficulties with governance, ultimately, and a problem with trust, which is ultimately, as I didn't already emphasize, if I didn't already emphasize, is they're sort of, as I see it, the glue or the stem cells of any social group, not just society, but any social group, including a group of innovators, collaborators, whether it be internal to the agency or external to the agency, that are coming together to talk through issues. The other trend, next slide, The other trend is just increased polarization. And this is just an index that we developed at Ipsos. And it's nothing more than taking a whole bunch of issues, looking at the partisan differences and plotting it over time. And I want to emphasize this because this undermines trust as well. This has a systemic impact, not just on politics, but how we engage at all with other human beings. By the way, the Young family, half of it's Brazilian, half of it's American. We don't usually get in any sort of conflict because our sports aren't the same, right? So we can root for the national teams of both. But ultimately, we don't talk red or blue at the Thanksgiving dinner. We don't talk red or green at the Christmas dinner in Brazil. These are sorts of things we don't talk about because they're extremely polarizing and they undermine trust both systemically and also in terms of group interaction. So the point I want to make is we have these forces today that are not helping us do business. They're making transaction costs greater, right? And ultimately, the question is, how can you facilitate that? How can you improve trust? How can you be more credible? I'll use that word a lot because that's a word I use a lot with clients, private sector, public sector, third sector, being credible relative to your audience. Credibility exercised over time builds trust. We know that scientifically speaking. How do you do that? In order to think about it, let's go to the next slide. We're going to have to think a bit about, I have the negative outcomes here. We've talked about that. Next slide, please. A bit about the brain. I don't know if the brain is blue. I don't think it's quite blue, but it is here. But understanding what's going on as we process information, a lot of the work we've done at Ipsos is not the basic science. We just take the basic science and kind of synthesize it. But we synthesize it to help our clients do exactly what I was just saying. How do you engage in a way that's trustful and trustworthy, right? And there's a couple critical points I want to make here. The first point is that we typically, when we evaluate something, we sort of look at like what's important to us and how well that thing performs on that thing we think is important. Man, that's really, really abstract, right? What the heck is Cliff talking about? I'll take it back to politics. What's the number one issue today in the United States? Inflation. Who's strongest on inflation? Well, the candidate strongest on inflation probably has a better evaluation than the candidate that's weaker on inflation. And this sort of way of processing information by rankings and ratings is replete in all sort of domains. We see it across the board. This is how humans ultimately process information. And I'll come back to that in a second when I talk about practical takeaways. The next slide, please. The next point is it's an issue of packaging of information. How is that information shown? Does it have a blue tint or a red tint or a purple tint or a green tint, whatever it might be? How is it shown? How is it delivered? Will have a lot to do with whether that information is actually even processed by the person. The question is, I not only have to think about what's really important for people, I know that based on the cognitive science, that's what gets people out of bed and going in the morning, but I also have to think about how I package the way I deliver information to people, how I talk to people, how I engage people, right? And here I use the analogy of the clown and the woman. I often use this in a class I teach at Johns Hopkins, but basically think of it like this. I'm walking down the street, I'm on Massachusetts, but down a ways where the old Johns Hopkins was. That way, I guess that way. And I hear a scream. That scream calls my attention. If I turn and I see a clown screaming, I'm gonna actually run, because that's not that. Yeah, I mean, a screaming clown in the middle of DC on Madison Avenue. I'm not quite sure, but the point being, that information is not credible to me, right? That's actually scary. There might be a threat there. The same me walking down Mass Ave again, I hear a scream, and I look over and I see a woman bleeding. So what am I going to do? How am I going to react? I'm going to go, oh, she needs help. I might run towards her. I might take out my cell phone and call 911. That information, the same scream, it sounded the same, was packaged in very, very different ways. It had very, very different meanings. Okay? Ultimately, information that's not credible, I discard, I get rid of. Information that's credible, I more fully reflect on, I embed that in my decision making. Okay? So what's the rank order of my needs or wants given a specific domain? What do I want? And two, understanding that the packaging of information has a differential effect as to whether I will process that information more or not. Next slide. Okay. And here, you could just go click it because it's a, yeah, there we go. So here, it's just like the packaging of information is about words, words, words. It's how we put stuff together. That's what it ultimately is, right? Understanding what's the number one issue for people, what they really want, is one sort of task. The other one is understanding, and I'll talk about this at the end, understanding the word landscape of the given domain, of a given innovation exercise, of a given agency, of the constituencies of a given agency, as an example. Next slide. And here, ultimately, the question is, understanding this, can we build trust? More specifically, can we build credibility in a trustless world? And next slide. And I have basically three kind of takeaways from this that we emphasize a lot with our clients, whether our clients are out there wanting to communicate. We don't work with parties or politicians, but a party or politician could communicate. Companies can communicate, agencies can, organizations can communicate with their constituency groups. So what are the three to establish trust, to reinforce trust, to build it over time? The next slide. The first one, there's a lot of data here, but I just want to say this is what I'm tracking day by day, what's going on with the elections. The number one issue is the economy. The number one issue is inflation. And we won't go into specifics as to who is stronger and who is weaker on this specific issue. But this is an example of ultimately people's rank ordering. And I just put up here, just on the title, meet people where they are. This goes for your collaborators. Like, what do they want to get out of that collaboration? Are the desires of the demands of the collaborators the same internally or externally? Do you know that? I'm not saying you even need to do research. You can just engage and talk at times, right? Is that me? That's my cell phone? Okay, there we go. So in any case, collaborators. And I also put the 85% rule. What do we know by that? Just to reinforce the importance of meeting people where they are, meaning meeting their most important needs, understanding those needs, listening to them. The 85% rule is the candidate strongest on the main issue wins 85% of the time. It's just a proxy. It's a proxy for the importance of meeting people where they are, ultimately, right? When you think about innovation, are these innovations meeting citizen demands or desires? Are they? Innovation for innovation's sake probably won't be as impactful and effective in the long term relative to one that is aligned with what people want. So meet people where they are. Lots of basic science shows that doing that reinforces trust with constituency groups. It's just that you have to understand that, and most importantly, listen in one way or another. You could do it through research in a more sophisticated way. You could do it in a more informal way by listening to your key constituencies. Next one. We've already talked about the issue of words, and I put here, know the words of your craft. Do you know the words of your craft? If you're managing a brand, do you know the words of your specific target area? If you're running an agency or a department in an agency, do you know the words of your constituency groups? And here I'm not talking necessarily formally, but informally, are you taking down notes? I always do it, by the way. I always pay attention to these sorts of things. Because again, I am especially worried about how I package information because I want information to be optimally impactful, right? Are we promising collaborators, things that actually they desire and they want? Is the value proposition interesting to them, as an example? Are we using words that we shouldn't? It's less of an issue, obviously, in politics and in business. We don't talk politics often, obviously. But do you understand the word landscape of your constituency groups? Here I just have like an interesting experiment just showing the differential effect of associating words with support for an infrastructure bill. It's just a proof point. Just wanted to show that depending on how you frame the word salad relative to a given issue, people will be more or less likely to process that information or more or less likely to discard it. Look at economists and experts. Republicans, Democrats can get behind them equally. And lastly, the third point, next. The third point is basically walking a walk, not just talking the talk. And I have a couple things going on this slide because I think they're very, very interesting. It's something we've shared a lot. We've taken, on the right, we took maybe 400 different people, places, and things and took the averages. And we see that brands are much more favorable, let's say, than politics, government, and news organizations. We have personalities kind of in the middle. And the point I wanted to make here is your brand proposition, your value proposition, and delivering on it consistently over time is super important. Governments have a lot bigger challenge because they have to deal, they have a responsibility, they have as a mandate to ultimately deal with multiple constituencies, a population of citizens, for the sake of argument. Brands, on the flip side, can be very niche. Their value proposition can be very specific. It's an interesting case study to show that they're more able to walk the walk and talk the talk because of their unique nature, the sort of sector that they're in, and their ability to be specific, focused, and niche-oriented, as I already said. But emphasizing once again, thinking about this, the ability that your ability to understand this, understanding whatever you set out with your key constituency groups, it's important that you ultimately deliver on what you promised. The other side is actually Tom Hanks, but it could be Taylor Swift as well. And the point is, both of these figures stepped into politics, and we can see their favorability scores declining. And once again, it's not about the politics in and of itself. It's about the fact that they didn't walk the walk and talk the talk. They weren't faithful to their own brand proposition, and they ultimately got clobbered. I only have Hanks here, but obviously he got involved in a lot of the discussions about COVID. We won't go into the merits, the values of that judgment on that, but ultimately he was in the inability to walk and talk the talk. Last slide. And so kind of bring it all together. Broad-based problems with trust, systemic distrust, as we said, lots of social changes. Social change reinforces that. It makes the word environment complicated in a larger sense. We understand things from cognitive science, especially the packaging of words is critical for further, more deep elaboration, reflection to get people to do stuff. Or if you have the wrong word configuration, people discard it. And the three ways we often talk with our clients about how you can go about improving trust with your constituencies. One, meeting people where they are, right? That's super important. We often forget that. You don't have to do research with Ipsos to understand that. You can go out and just talk with them. At least think about it conceptually. The second is understanding the words of your craft. Is there a problematic distribution or landscape of words? Maybe there isn't in what you do, but at least have a notion and understanding of that. At the very least, the broad political words, which I believe probably all of you try to stay away from, are problematic. And lastly, it's about walking the walk and talking the talk. Making promises that you can't deliver are basically the death knell of any sort of trust. And so with that, thank you.